pointed out, society in general and companies are generally increasingly aware of the problem, but they often say they can't do any better. And I'm looking at that more in the company's perspective now than the customers. And we have to admit that supply chains have become very complex and fragile. Of course, the recent episode of the Suez Canal blocking 12% of world trade is a telling demonstration of that, but this is only the surface of things. The real snag is that the complexity comes with additional opacity. Customers and businesses alike are often caught not knowing what they are buying from, and they're of course totally unaware of the economic, social, environmental conditions surrounding their most distant suppliers, those who are not tier 1 but tier 2, tier 3. Take the example of the 1995 Kobe earthquake. We may remember that, and some people in the audience may remember that precisely. The damages were massive because it was the first time such an earthquake was happening there, particularly. And suddenly the world car makers' production was affected and had to slow down. Why? Because, unknown to most people in the profession, there was one screen display supplier who was delivering displays to all car radio and vehicle audio producers around the world. As these displays were present on the majority of cars produced on the planet, and as the plant was destroyed by the earthquake, this was, of course, a big challenge. In October 2011, in a different setting, there was this time the world notebook PCs production that was stopped after a Chinese supplier was closed down by regulators because, believe it or not, neighbors had complained about pollution and bad odors. In the early stages of COVID-19 crisis, 72% of US businesses have reported supply chain disruptions. The figure is less in Europe, it's 58%, and even less in Japan, it's 41%. But this goes to show how interdependent we've become and how difficult it is to have a complete mapping of the origin of all supplies. Therefore, as Brian also pointed out, we may not all be aware of it, but we are all exposed to being the actual sponsors of slave labor, child labor, and other difficult conditions, because we are just partly willingly and partly unwillingly not looking or not aware. And precisely because it is very difficult to know, this may discourage companies from doing the appropriate research. So therefore, legislation has become more and more demanding over the last decade. The earliest legislation, I think, regarding directly human rights and companies' implications were Californian laws in 2010 and the UN guiding principles in 2011. But it started really in 2014 when a series of laws were adopted in a number of countries. The ILO updated its convention on forced labor. The US federal law called the Trafficking and Slavery Act was passed. The UN Sustainable Development Goals were published as well in 2015. UK adopted a Modern Slavery Act in 2016. And a very significant law also in 2017 was the French duty of vigilance law that was passed. It's very far-reaching in terms of obligations for companies, and so forth. The US adopted a new law in 2020, and so forth. In 2021, it's very interesting because there will no doubt be a EU duty of vigilance law, because the European Parliament just passed a resolution last month requiring the European Commission to set up this law. So you may ask, why this mounting pressure on companies? I think it's a sad story, and I would call it the chocolate Easter bunny story. You may have eaten a lot of chocolates for Easter recently, I don't know, I hope so. It's very unfortunate that, of course, there is 90% chance that there was some slave labor included in those chocolate eggs and bunnies. But the most unfortunate thing is that facts have been known and reported for more than 20 years. And in spite of that, not much has been achieved to curb slave and child laborers in cocoa plantations since. To be very precise, back in 2001, the three major chocolate companies called Mars, you know, M&M's, of course, and all these nice things, Hershey's and Nestle, pledged in front of US Congress to eradicate the worst form of child labor from their West African cocoa suppliers within 4 years. That would have been in 2005. They missed the deadline, so they set themselves another one 3 years later. They missed it as well, so they negotiated a new one for 2010. And here we are in 2019, Mars explaining to journalists of the Washington Post that they had done their best efforts, but that they could trace only 24% of their chocolate, of their cocoa, let's say, back to farms. Hershey said 50 and Nestle said 49%. In the same way, Mondelez and Godiva, also very significant producers of chocolate, couldn't guarantee any of their products in terms of, for instance, being free of child labor. So in 2021, these companies, it's not surprised that they were sued in the US for breaching the child slavery law in the US. And I even think this law may have been drafted and adopted because of their behavior in the way they handled their promises to the US Congress. If we look in a more global fashion, in a survey a few years back, only a third of companies were found to be actively seeking transparency below tier 1 in their supply chain. This is, of course, not good enough because the main risks and the most critical situations lie the deeper you go into the supply chain. It's interesting to read the European Parliament resolution that I have just mentioned. It's a bit legalese in terms of the way it's written, but they say the European Parliament considers, quote, that voluntary due diligence standards have not achieved significant progress in preventing human rights and environmental harm and in enabling access to justice. And therefore, the European Parliament voted a motion urgently urging the European Commission to adopt binding requirements for undertakings, companies, to identify, account for, address, and remediate potential and/or actual adverse impact on human rights, the environment, and good governance in their value chain. End of quote. So there is not a lot of choice left. The question is how? To establish transparency, companies need to trace their supply chain down to the far end, audit, mitigate any abuse, or even stop the particular business relations where they cannot fix the problems. It's very complex in some regions. Audits are difficult to conduct because of corruption. The abundance of consultants ready to produce fake reports against remuneration is astonishing. Conflict-affected areas also make the matter more complex. However, I think it's clear that neither complexity nor corruption can be regarded as big enough obstacles for large companies in times of big data. You may wonder whether this is purely theoretical or whether implementation has already been done. An example of due diligence to which I've been exposed directly is the case of palm oil coming into Japan. A friend called Professor Hiroshi Ishida, who could have come and spoken today, but it's very late in Japan as we are now. It's already, I think, 11 o'clock at night, has been piloting this initiative. The Co-Roundtable Japan is the head of the Co-Roundtable Japan, which is originally a group of CEOs who met in Switzerland over an agenda of creating peace and understanding where there was trade wars and mistrust between the US, Europe, and Japan. One of their work was to establish the core principles for business, a shared code of conduct for business all over the world, which was published, I believe, 26 years ago now. And they pioneered in there a complete view of CSR. In Japan, these core principles for business had a big impact. Many companies and the Keidan Ren, the Japanese Employers Association, studied them and used them. Therefore, they established an association in the year 2000 to help companies implement CSR in an effective way, called the Co-Roundtable Japan. And they organize now a yearly business and human rights conference in Tokyo since 2012. They help companies identify their key CSR and human rights issue by organizing inclusive stakeholder engagement programs or human rights due diligence workshops, as they call them, and then helping companies conduct human rights risk and impact assessments, helping companies conduct a series of materiality assessments or audits. And this is done with partnering experts such as SEDEX, Supplier Ethical Data Exchange, or Verisk Maplecroft, which is a consulting company providing a lot of data. This is the very basic implementation of the first UN Guiding Principles of 2011, or OECD recommendations that have come in since. And to come back to palm oil, this has led CRT Japan to work with the 4 main importers of palm oil in their supply chain, on their supply chain for Japan. These companies together are importing 95% of all palm oil that comes into Japan. There are a number of months of travels to palm oil producing countries, Japanese firms, that is mainly Indonesia, Malaysia, Burma, and Thailand. They were able to develop awareness and produce an exhaustive mapping of all flows. Palm oil passes through from growers, often very small farms, to grinding mills, and then it's shipped by sea. Then it goes to refiners, chemical processors, and finally manufacturers. Each facility involved is identified with the Blue Number system. Blue Number IDs were introduced at the UN in 2015 as a tool to track and measure the Sustainable Development Goals. It's done from a beneficiary-centric perspective. So, in fact, it goes down to the individual worker. The individual worker can be identified. Any small farmer or supplier with a blue number can be engaged directly, tracked, asked for self-declaration of practices, and incentivized for better performance. For agricultural commodities, such as the raw material for palm oil, blue numbers can reveal the location of every farmer and facilities to confirm no deforestation, no planting in protected areas, etc. But unfortunately, this palm oil business for Japan is not the majority of palm oil business in the world. So there is a lot of work to do. I would say the remaining 90% of palm oil business. Yet other industries are making progress. For instance, in October 2019, the Business and Human Rights Conference of CRT in Tokyo, Japan, there was an interesting sharing by Toyo Rice Corporation of how they fare in achieving their journey towards UN Sustainable Development Goals using these blue numbers. And their work that they presented was with 205 farmers under 11 Farmers Association and the whole supply chain. Well, anyway, this is not advertisement for CRT Japan as such. This is really to put the performance of the chocolate industry into perspective. And I think the poor performance of chocolate industry under a crude light. If we put ourselves in the shoes of the purchasing department of a company, now I will ask you a question. What would you say are the keys for a good and sustainable supplier relationship? The reality is that a company's competitiveness is achieved partly by securing low purchasing prices, and therefore the exercise is not that simple. However, most companies are ready to pay a few % more to get better quality, better accountability, and to mitigate risks in the supply chain. Certainly, mapping out the supply chain completely has positive effects on traditional purchasing performance by providing traceability, digital proof of delivery and financing, certification and analytics. And it also brings new benefits such as reducing supply chain risks and enabling responsible procurement. So although prices and conditions are subject to tough negotiations, I would say there is need for more transparency, more trust and cooperation in a responsible supplier relationship. But this may be a question you may want to discuss in your small groups after this presentation.